There are moments in life that split your world in two, before and after. Last week, I lived in the before. It was a simple place, full of routine and comfortable monotony. My wife, Jennifer, and I had been married for 7 years. She was ambitious, sharp, and beautiful, the kind of person who turned heads when she walked into a room. Me? I'm Greg, your average guy with an average job and a slightly above-average beer gut. We weren't perfect, but we worked, or so I thought. The after began on a rainy Tuesday. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. My boss had wrapped up a meeting early, and instead of sticking around the office pretending to work, I decided to surprise Jen by coming home a couple of hours ahead of schedule. I even picked up her favorite takeout on the way. That's the kind of husband I am, or at least was. When I walked into the house, it felt off. The lights were dimmed, and the air smelled faintly of lavender like Jen's favorite candle. Skittles, our perpetually grumpy cat, shot me a look of disdain before scurrying upstairs, his usual welcome home routine. I called out, "Jen?" But the house remained silent. I wandered into the living room, setting down the takeout bag on the coffee table. That's when I noticed her phone lying on the couch, screen glowing faintly. Normally, I wouldn't even think about touching it. Her phone was her private world, filled with work emails, Pinterest boards, and TikTok videos of people organizing pantries. But the screen was lit with a message preview that caught my eye. "I can still feel your hands on. My tool every time I think of you. Are you sure you don't want to remind me what it's really like? Tonight? Your call." I picked up the phone, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. Yes, I knew her passcode. We weren't exactly a secretive couple, or so I'd thought. The message was from someone saved as Mark Jim. At first, I told myself there must be a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe Mark Jim was her personal trainer, and this was some weird motivational message. But the thread of texts told a different story. "You bring out a side of me I forgot I had," one read. "I'll make sure no one suspects anything," read another. "The kind of things you don't say to your trainer or anyone who's not your husband." I sat down hard on the couch, the phone still clutched in my hand. My heart was racing, and I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of shared memories, inside jokes, late-night talks about our dreams and fears. All of it now felt like a cruel joke. My first instinct was to storm into whatever gym this guy worked at and punch him in the face. My second instinct was to confront Jen right away, demand answers, and get the truth out of her. But then another thought bubbled up, one that was pettier, less rational, and far more satisfying. Why not fight fire with fire? If she thought she could sneak around and get away with it, maybe it was time I reminded her of who she was married to. I wasn't just some boring, predictable husband. I was still capable of turning heads, of making someone's heart skip a beat. If she could have her little Mark Jim, then I'd show her that I wasn't so easily replaced. The idea was ridiculous, I'll admit. I'm not exactly the kind of guy women throw themselves at. I've got a receding hairline, a wardrobe that's 90% flannel, and a sense of humor that only Skittles seems to appreciate. But there was a part of me, a stubborn, wounded part, that refused to sit back and play the victim. That night, I sat across from Jen at the dinner table, my mind racing. She was scrolling through her phone, smiling faintly at something. Maybe it was a meme, or maybe it was him. I stabbed at my mashed potatoes, trying to suppress the wave of anger that threatened to spill over. "You're quiet tonight," she said, looking up at me with those big, expressive eyes that I used to find so comforting. Now they just felt like a mystery. "Long day at work," I replied, forcing a smile. "Well, don't work too hard," she said, leaning over to kiss my cheek. It was such a normal, everyday gesture that, for a second, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the phone was still in my pocket, the messages still burned into my brain. That night, lying next to her in bed, I couldn't sleep. Jen dozed off easily, her breathing soft and even. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few months, looking for clues I'd missed. The late nights, at work. The sudden interest in fitness. The way she'd started laughing at her phone more often. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. But I also felt something else. A determination I hadn't felt in years. If Jen thought I was some boring, clueless husband, then she was about to get a wake-up call. I didn't know where to start. I'd never been the type to flirt or pick up women. My idea of a wild night was ordering an extra-large pizza and watching an entire season of Breaking Bad. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I'd prove to Jen, and to me, that I was still desirable, still exciting, still capable of turning the tables. Little did I know my plan for revenge would turn out to be far more complicated and humiliating than I ever could have imagined. If I thought coming up with the idea to get even with Jen was the hard part, I was sorely mistaken. As it turns out, putting that plan into action is a whole different beast. For starters, I had absolutely no clue where to begin. My knowledge of the dating world was as outdated as my high school yearbook photo, and the last time I picked someone up, it involved handing Jen a bouquet of gas station flowers and mumbling something about dinner. Smooth, right? But I wasn't going to let my lack of experience stop me. I was on a mission of, well, pettiness, mostly. Step 1? Find a bar where I could test the waters. Step 2? Charm someone, anyone. Step 3? Prove to myself, and to Jen, that I wasn't the boring husband she apparently thought I was. After extensive Googling, and by extensive, I mean 20 minutes of scrolling through Yelp reviews, I found a place called the Velvet Lounge. The reviews promised a lively atmosphere and great opportunities to meet people. It sounded perfect. I put on my nicest shirt, an old button-up that still kind of fit, and sprayed on some cologne that I hadn't used since our last anniversary dinner. I was ready. Walking into the Velvet Lounge felt like stepping onto a completely different planet. The music was loud, the lights were dim, and the people looked like they'd all walked straight out of a fashion magazine. I, on the other hand, looked like someone's dad who'd accidentally wandered in while looking for the hardware store. I ordered a drink, something strong to calm my nerves, and surveyed the room. Most of the women were in groups, laughing, and chatting in a way that made it impossible to approach without looking like a total creep. But then I saw her, a stunning brunette sitting at the bar sipping a martini. She was alone, and every so often she glanced around the room like she was waiting for something or someone. This is it, I thought. My chance. I took a deep breath, grabbed my drink, and made my way over to her. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. As I got closer, I noticed her smile was even prettier up close. She glanced at me as I awkwardly slid onto the stool next to her. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Is this seat taken?" She smiled politely. "No, go ahead." So far, so good. I introduced myself, and she told me her name was Lily. She had this effortless charm, the kind that made me wonder what someone like her was doing alone at a place like this. We made small talk for a few minutes, mostly me fumbling over my words while she sipped her drink and nodded. I was just starting to feel like maybe I wasn't completely out of my depth when disaster struck. In an attempt to appear suave, I gestured toward the bartender to signal for another drink. Unfortunately, in my nervous excitement, I misjudged the movement and knocked over my glass. The contents, whiskey, ice, and all, spilled straight into Lily's lap. "Oh my God!" she gasped, jumping up as the cold liquid soaked through her dress. My brain went into full panic mode. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, grabbing a handful of napkins and trying to help. But before I could even attempt damage control, a large shadow loomed behind me. What the hell is going on here? I turned to see a man who looked like he could bench press a truck glaring down at me. He had the kind of physique that made me instantly regret every cheeseburger I'd ever eaten. Judging by the way he stepped protectively in front of Lily, it was clear. He wasn't just some random guy. It was an accident, I said quickly, holding up my hands in surrender. I swear. He didn't look convinced. Maybe you should leave before you have another accident. Normally, I'd like to think I'd stand my ground in a situation like this, but between the whiskey in Lily's lap and the sheer size of her boyfriend, I decided to cut my losses. I muttered another apology and made a hasty retreat, my face burning with humiliation. By the time I got home, I was still seething, mostly at myself. I'd gone into that bar thinking I'd prove something, and instead, I'd managed to spill my drink on a stranger, piss off her boyfriend, and flee like a coward. To make matters worse, Jen was still awake, sitting on the couch with her laptop. "You're home late," she said, glancing up at me. "Rough night?" "Something like that," I mumbled, kicking off my shoes. She raised an eyebrow. "You look flustered. What happened? Did you trip over your own feet again?" I froze, wondering if she somehow knew what I'd been up to. But then she laughed, a light, teasing laugh that reminded me of the early days of our relationship. "Relax, I'm kidding," she said. I forced a smile and went upstairs, feeling like the world's biggest idiot. My grand plan to even the score was off to a terrible start, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Jen somehow suspected something. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I told myself one thing. Next time, it'll be different. Next time, I'll get it right. Spoiler alert, I wouldn't. After the disaster at the Velvet Lounge, I was ready to throw in the towel. But every time I thought about Jen's texts with Mark Jim, a fire reignited in me. I wasn't about to give up. Sure, my first attempt at evening the score had ended in humiliation, but I was determined to try again, this time with a more strategic approach. That's when it hit me. Why not keep things close to home? Or, more specifically, the office. At work, there was a woman named Vanessa. She was funny, easy to talk to, and always laughed at my terrible jokes during meetings. She wasn't just approachable. She had this magnetic energy about her that made her seem like the life of every party. I figured if anyone could help me bounce back from my disastrous debut in the world of infidelity, it was her. The plan was simple. Invite Vanessa to lunch under the guise of catching up on some work project. Flirt a little, see where things went. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally get the validation I was craving. When I casually mentioned grabbing lunch together, Vanessa didn't hesitate. "Sure," she said with a smile. "There's that new Italian place a few blocks away. Let's go there." Perfect. The restaurant was cozy, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic bread wafting through the air. Vanessa was already waiting at a corner table when I arrived, looking effortlessly stylish in a red blouse that made her stand out like a cherry on a sundae. I felt a small surge of confidence as I sat down. We started with small talk, work, gossip, vacation plans, the usual office banter. I was careful to keep things light, but added a few well-placed compliments. "You always know how to brighten up the office, Vanessa," I said, trying to sound smooth. She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Greg, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were buttering me up for something." "Maybe I am," I replied, surprising myself with how bold it sounded. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in days, I felt like I was winning. I didn't need to be some suave playboy. I just needed to be me. That's when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a familiar figure walking past the restaurant window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. No way, I told myself. What are the odds? But then the figure turned toward the entrance, and my heart stopped. It was Jen. She walked into the restaurant, her eyes scanning the room. For a split second, I thought maybe she was just here by coincidence, meeting a friend or grabbing takeout. But when her gaze landed on me, and Vanessa, her face lit up with an expression that was both amused and calculated. "Oh no. Oh no, no, no. Greg!" Jen called out, her voice loud enough to turn a few heads. She strode over to our table with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Vanessa looked up, startled. "Oh, hi," she said uncertainly. "Hi there," Jen said, her tone sugary sweet. She turned to me, her eyes sparkling, with mischief. "Fancy running into you here. Who's your friend?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. Before I could respond, Jen extended a hand to Vanessa. "I'm Jennifer, Greg's wife. It's so nice to meet you." Vanessa's eyes widened. "Oh, I didn't realize," she trailed off, glancing between me and Jen like she'd just stumbled into a live-action soap opera. Jen didn't miss a beat. "Greg's been working so hard lately," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I'm glad he's taking a break to have lunch with a colleague. Isn't he the best?" The sheer audacity of her performance left me speechless. Vanessa, meanwhile, looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. Yeah," she mumbled, clearly uncomfortable. "I should probably get back to the office. Thanks for lunch, Greg." She grabbed her bag and practically sprinted out of the restaurant. Once she was gone, Jen slid into the chair across from me, a satisfied smirk on her face. "Nice place," she said, glancing around. "I've been meaning to try it. What's good here?" I stared at her, my face burning with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "What the hell was that?" I hissed. She leaned forward, her smirk turning into a grin. "That, my dear husband, was me making sure you don't do anything stupid. You looked like you needed a reminder." "A reminder of what?" I shot back. "That you're terrible at keeping secrets," she said, standing up and grabbing her purse. "I'll see you at home. Don't forget to pick up Skittles' food on the way." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me alone at the table with 2 untouched plates of pasta and a rapidly crumbling sense of dignity. By the time I got home that evening, the embarrassment had settled into a dull ache in my chest. Jen acted like nothing had happened, chatting about her day while I stood in the kitchen, replaying the scene over and over in my head. Skittles stared at me from his perch on the counter, his expression as judgmental as ever. "Don't look at me like that," I muttered. Jen poked her head into the kitchen, a playful glint in her eye. "Everything okay? You seem a little distracted." I glared at her, but she just laughed and walked away, humming to herself. As I collapsed onto the couch later that night, one thought kept running through my mind. How the hell am I going to pull this off if she's always one step ahead of me? After the disaster with Vanessa and Jen's impromptu performance, I knew I had to change my strategy. The office wasn't safe, and bars were clearly a no-go. That's when it hit me. The world had gone digital. If Jen could sneak around with Mark Jim, surely I could find someone through a dating app. Setting up a profile was equal parts thrilling and horrifying. I used a picture from our vacation 2 years ago. It was the last time I looked remotely tan and happy. For my bio, I kept it vague. Just a guy looking for some fun and good conversation. It felt painfully generic, but I wasn't aiming to win any awards here. Within a few hours, I matched with someone named Claire. She was in her early 30s, blonde, with a smile that made her seem approachable. We exchanged a few messages, and she suggested grabbing coffee at a quiet little cafe downtown. It seemed perfect. Neutral territory, low stakes, no alcohol to spill on anyone. The day of the meetup, I was a bundle of nerves. I told myself this wasn't about actually doing anything. It was just about proving I could, that I still had it, whatever it was. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, grabbed a seat by the window, and tried not to look like a man teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Claire walked in right on time, her smile as warm and inviting as her profile picture. She spotted me, waved, and made her way over. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of confidence. "Greg, right?" she said, sitting across from me. "Yeah," I replied, trying not to sound like I'd rehearsed that single word in my head 100 times. We started chatting, and to my surprise, the conversation flowed naturally. She was funny, easygoing, and refreshingly non-judgmental about the fact that I couldn't remember the last time I'd been on a real date. I was just starting to think that maybe, just maybe, this was going to work when I heard a voice behind me. "Greg, is that you?" That voice was painfully familiar. I turned slowly, like a character in a horror movie about to face the monster, and there he was. Matt, my co-worker from accounting. Matt was the kind of guy who knew everyone's business and loved to share it. He had a sixth sense for sniffing out drama, and he wielded gossip like a weapon. The look on his face made it clear he was enjoying every second of this. "What are you doing here?" Matt asked, his eyes darting between me and Claire. "Is this a work meeting?" I scrambled for an explanation, my brain running in circles like a hamster on a wheel. Yeah, work meeting. Claire's, consulting for us." Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly confused but smart enough to stay quiet. Matt crossed his arms, smirking. "Consulting? On what? You're in marketing, right? I didn't know we were hiring freelancers." "It's, a new thing," I stammered. "Experimental, top secret." Matt's smirk grew wider. "Top secret?" "Must be, considering I've never heard of it." The room suddenly felt about 10 degrees hotter. Claire, bless her, jumped in to save me. "I think what Greg means is that it's early stages," she said smoothly, shooting me a look that said, "You owe me big time." Matt wasn't convinced, but before he could press further, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "Well, I'd love to stay and chat about this fascinating project, but I've got to get back to the office. Don't work too hard, Greg." As he walked away, I slumped back in my chair, my face burning with embarrassment. Claire studied me for a moment, then leaned forward. "Okay, what's really going on here?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. I debated telling her the truth. It wasn't like I could make things any worse. "Look, it's complicated," I said finally. "I'm going through some stuff with my wife." This was supposed to be... I trailed off, realizing how pathetic I sounded. Claire nodded slowly, then gave me a small smile. "Greg, you seem like a decent guy, but maybe this isn't the best way to deal with whatever you're dealing with." She stood up, grabbed her bag, and gave me one last, sympathetic look. "Good luck, though. And maybe think about talking to your wife instead of meeting strangers in coffee shops." When I got home that evening, I was a mix of embarrassed and defeated. Jen was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She glanced up when I walked in. "You're late," she said casually. "Long day at work?" "Something like that," I muttered, heading straight for the couch. As I sat there, staring at the blank TV screen, I couldn't shake the feeling that Matt would be back at the office tomorrow, spinning some ridiculous story about seeing me on a business date. The thought of him knowing, even suspecting what I was up to made my skin crawl. And then there was Claire's parting advice. Talk to my wife? That felt about as appealing as a root canal without anesthesia. Jen poked her head into the living room, a curious look on her face. "You okay? You seem off." "I'm fine," I said, too exhausted to come up with anything else. She shrugged and went back to the kitchen, humming softly to herself. As I sat, there one thought kept running through my mind. Maybe I'm not cut out for this revenge thing. Spoiler alert, I wasn't. By the time my third attempt at revenge had crumbled into awkward excuses and a co-worker's knowing smirk, I realized something had to change. My first mistake had been going solo. Every plan I'd come up with so far relied on me navigating unfamiliar waters alone, and each attempt had only highlighted how clueless I was. This time I needed an accomplice, someone who could meet me. Halfway. That's when the idea hit me. Jen's best friend Becca was outgoing, flirty, and most importantly single. She was always the life of the party, the kind of woman who could light up a room with a laugh and a martini. Over the years, I'd gotten to know her pretty well. Not enough to think this would be easy, but enough to think it might just work. The plan was simple. Jen and I were invited to a party hosted by one of her co-workers, and I'd make sure Becca was there too. A little charm, a little alcohol, and maybe I'd finally succeed where I'd failed before. The party was at a chic downtown loft, the kind of place that made me feel like I should have worn something fancier than a button-up shirt and jeans. Jen, of course, looked stunning in a sleek black dress, her confidence radiating as she mingled with the crowd. Becca arrived about an hour later, already in high spirits, waving enthusiastically as she spotted us. "Greg! Jen! You made it!" she exclaimed, pulling us both into a hug. "Wouldn't miss it," Jen said with a smile before getting pulled into a conversation with some co-workers. This was my chance. I grabbed a couple of drinks and handed one to Becca. "You look great tonight," I said, trying to sound casual. She laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Thanks, Greg. You clean up pretty well yourself." So far, so good. We chatted for a while, and I tried to subtly steer the conversation in a more personal direction. Becca seemed to be enjoying the attention, and I was starting to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this time things wouldn't end in disaster. Then she started drinking. Now, I've seen Becca let loose before. She's the kind of person who knows how to have a good time. But tonight, she seemed determined to outdo herself. One cocktail turned into 3, then 4, and before I knew it, she was teetering on her heels and slurring her words. "You know," she said, leaning in way too close, "I've always thought you were kind of cute, Greg." I blinked, caught completely off guard. This was not exactly how I'd pictured this going. Thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Becca giggled and poked me in the chest. "But you're also, like, super awkward. It's adorable, honestly, like a puppy that trips over its own feet." This was spiraling out of control fast. I glanced around, trying to gauge where Jen was. She was across the room, laughing with a group of people, but her eyes flicked toward us every so often. "Maybe we should get you some water," I suggested, but Becca waved me off. No, I'm fine," she said, stumbling slightly as she tried to take another sip of her drink. And then she said it. The one thing that turned an already precarious situation into a full-blown disaster. "You know," she announced loudly, "Jen's so lucky to have you. If I were her, I'd never let you out of my sight." "But don't tell her I said that. She doesn't even know what she's got." Her voice carried across the room, and I saw Jen freeze mid-laugh. Her eyes narrowed as she turned toward us, her smile fading into something far less friendly. "Oh no." "Becca," Jen said, walking over with a deliberate calmness that made my nerves fray. "What's going on here?" Becca beamed at her, completely oblivious to the tension. "Nothing. Greg's just being his sweet self. You're so lucky, Jen." Jen's gaze shifted to me, sharp and unreadable. "Is that so?" I started, but the words dried up in my throat. There was no explaining this in a way that wouldn't make me look guilty. Jen let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, isn't this interesting?" The car ride home was silent. Jen didn't say a word, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared out the window. I felt like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except the stakes were 1,000 times higher. When we got home, she finally broke the silence. "Do you want to tell me what that was all about?" she asked, her voice calm but icy. I hesitated, knowing that anything I said would only dig me deeper. "It was nothing. Becca was just being Becca." Becca doesn't usually get drunk and start calling me lucky, Jen shot back, so forgive me if I don't buy that. I didn't do anything, I said defensively, which was technically true but felt hollow. Jen shook her head, a bitter smile playing on her lips. You know, Greg, for someone who thinks he's so clever, you're really bad at hiding things. With that, she walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the living room with nothing but my humiliation and a very judgmental Skittles glaring at me from the couch. I sat there for hours, replaying the night in my head. I'd tried to be clever, to outsmart Jen, and instead, I'd managed to humiliate myself yet again. This was supposed to be my chance to reclaim some dignity, but all I'd done was dig myself a deeper hole. As I finally dragged myself upstairs to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a failed attempt at revenge. It was a wake-up call, and whether I was ready to face it or not, something had to change. By this point, I was starting to think my life was some kind of sitcom, and I was the bumbling husband getting laughed at by an unseen audience. Every one of my attempts to even the score had blown up in my face spectacularly. Meanwhile, Jen was carrying on as though nothing had changed. She'd smile at me over breakfast, ask me about my day like she hadn't crushed my dignity into a fine powder, and hum while she folded laundry. I hated it, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted between us. Jen had started paying more attention to me, not in a suspicious, I know what you're up to way, but in a softer, more curious way. It was little things at first. Lingering glances, the way she laughed at my jokes more often, even when they weren't funny. She started asking about my work, my friends, my plans for the weekend. For someone who had spent the last few months scrolling through her phone and disappearing to gym sessions, this was new, and it made me uneasy. One night we were sitting on the couch watching a movie. Well, Jen was watching. I was staring at the screen, but my mind was miles away, stuck in the same endless loop of anger, frustration, and humiliation. Greg, she said suddenly, pulling me out of my thoughts. Yeah? She hesitated, looking at me in a way that chill ran down my spine. It wasn't her usual confident, calculating look. This was softer, almost hesitant. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said automatically. No, you're not, she said, tilting her head slightly. You've been acting different, distracted, like something's bothering you. I wanted to laugh. Something's bothering me? Yeah, just the fact that my wife was cheating on me, and I was failing miserably at making her regret it. But instead, I just shrugged. It's nothing. Jen didn't buy it. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and studied me like I was some kind of puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. Greg, if something's wrong, you can tell me. You know that, right? I'm fine, I repeated, a little more sharply than I intended. Her expression flickered for a moment, like she was weighing whether or not to push. But then she just nodded and leaned back, her gaze drifting to the TV again. Over the next few days, I started noticing more of those small shifts in her behavior. She'd send me texts during the day, simple things like, "Hope your day's going okay," or "Don't forget Skittles' vet appointment." It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd done in months. She even suggested we go out to dinner one night, just the two of us. No phones, no distractions. It's been a while since we had a proper date, she said casually, as though this wasn't the same woman who'd been sneaking around with Mark Jim. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see what her angle was, if this was some kind of ploy to throw me off her scent. But the dinner was nice. We laughed, reminisced about the early days of our relationship, and for a few hours, it almost felt like old times. Almost. It wasn't until a few weeks later that things started to make sense. I was in the kitchen, half-heartedly scrolling through my phone while waiting for the coffee to brew. Jen walked in, still in her pajamas, her hair a mess. She grabbed a mug and leaned against the counter. watching me with that same curious look I'd noticed before. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot lately." I raised an eyebrow, not sure where this was going. "About what?" She hesitated, biting her lip in a way that made her look almost nervous. "About us? About how we've been with each other?" My heart skipped a beat. "Okay, and, she said, setting her mug down, "I think I've been taking you for granted." That caught me off guard. Jen wasn't exactly the admit she's wrong type. I stared at her, unsure if this was some kind of trap. "What do you mean?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I mean, you've been trying so hard lately. I don't know why, but it's obvious. And it made me realize you still care. You still want this to work." I froze, unsure how to respond. This wasn't how I'd pictured this conversation going. "You're my husband," she continued, her voice softer now. "And I haven't been treating you the way you deserve. I'm sorry for that." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know if I was angry, relieved, or just confused. "I know I've messed up," she said, looking down at her mug. "And I know I have a lot to make up for, but I want to try. If you still want to." For a moment, all I could do was stare at her. This was the woman who had been sneaking around behind my back, the woman who had made me question everything about our marriage. And now she was standing here asking for a second chance. I didn't know if I could forgive her. Hell, I didn't even know if I wanted to. But as I looked at her, I realized one thing. She was right about one thing. I did still care. "I don't." "No, Jen," I said finally, my voice low. "I need time to figure out what I want." She nodded, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. As she walked out of the kitchen, I sat down at the table, my head spinning. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same page, even if I wasn't sure where that page would take us. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting across from Jen at our kitchen table, having the most honest conversation of our lives, I would have laughed in their face. Hell, 6 months ago, I couldn't even imagine a world where we'd find our way back to each other. But here we were, two bruised hearts trying to figure out if they could still beat in sync. It all started with Jen's decision to come clean. I didn't see it coming. Not after everything we'd been through. One night, she walked into the living room while I was watching some old sitcom reruns and sat down next to me. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the floor like she was trying to gather her thoughts. "Greg," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "I need to tell you something." I turned off the TV. "What is it?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "I ended it, with Mark." My breath caught. I hadn't heard her say his name out loud before, and it hit like a punch to the gut. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, not sure whether I felt relieved or furious. She took a deep breath. "Because I realized something. These past few weeks, watching you. I don't know, Greg. You've been trying so hard, even when you didn't have to. Even when I didn't deserve it. And it made me see how badly I've screwed up. Jen, I don't—" I started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said. "I don't know why I did what I did. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was some stupid need to feel wanted. But none of that excuses how much I hurt you. And seeing you, how kind you've been. How much you've tried to make things better, even when you had every right to give up. It made me realize something important." She reached out and took my hand, her grip firm but gentle. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Greg, and I've been too blind to see it." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight and my mind was racing. Part of me wanted to lash out, to demand why she'd only come to this realization after everything she'd done. But another part of me, maybe the part that had been holding on to hope this whole time, wanted to believe her. "I don't know if I can just forget everything, Jen," I said finally. "I'm not asking you to," she replied. "I know I need to earn your trust again. But I want to try. I want us to try." The days that followed weren't easy. We didn't magically fix everything with one conversation. There were awkward silences, moments of doubt, and more than one argument about who had hurt whom the most. But for the first time in a long time, we were being honest with each other. Jen opened up about how she'd felt lost, how she'd been searching for something she couldn't even define. And I admitted how much her betrayal had broken me, how I'd tried to mask my pain with ridiculous attempts at revenge. "You really tried to flirt with Becca?" she asked one night, her tone a mix of amusement and disbelief. "I was desperate," I admitted, chuckling despite myself. "And clearly, I'm terrible at this kind of thing." She laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Greg, you're an idiot, but you're my idiot." Slowly, things began to shift. We started spending more time together, real time, not just sitting in the same room scrolling through our phones. We went on walks, cooked dinner together, even dusted off an old board game we used to play when we were first married. One night, as we were sitting on the couch with Skittles curled up between us, Jen turned to me and said, "You know what I realized?" "What?" I asked, absent-mindedly scratching the cat's head. "You've always been there for me," she said, "even when I didn't deserve it, even when I was too caught up in my own crap to see it. And I'm so lucky to have you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd been convinced that our marriage was broken beyond repair. But sitting there, hearing her say those things, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we still had a chance. "I'm lucky to have you too," I said softly. She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. Wasn't a perfect ending, because life isn't like that. There were still moments of doubt, still scars that needed time to heal. But for the first time in what felt like forever, we were moving forward together. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know one thing. Love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when things get messy. It's about fighting for each other, even when it feels easier to walk away. As I sat there with Jen by my side and Skittles snoring softly on my lap, I realized that maybe this was what love was all about. "What do you think? Did I make the right decision by giving her another chance? Or should I have walked away and started over? I'm still not sure if forgiveness was the best choice, but maybe love isn't about certainty. It's about taking risks." I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place?